Imagine a world where you don't celebrate the 4th of July with cheap fireworks and hot dogs. Instead, you're enjoying a nice, sensible bank holiday with a lukewarm cup of Earl Grey, staring lovingly at a portrait of King Charles III. Why? Because the land of the free never happened. The great American experiment died in a muddy ditch in Virginia. To understand this timeline, we have to destroy the biggest myth your kindergarten teacher taught you, that the American Revolution was won by plucky farmers fighting for freedom. False. It was won by French money, French gunpowder, and the French Navy. So here is our point of divergence. October 1781, Yorktown. In our timeline, the French fleet blockades the Chesapeake, trapping the British. But in this timeline, the Royal Navy, the most powerful death machine on the planet, actually does its job. They smash the French fleet to splinters. General Cornwallis doesn't surrender. Washington does. But if you think the British would just line the Founding Fathers up against a wall and shoot them, you are drastically underestimating how greedy the British Empire actually was. See, the British didn't want a graveyard. They wanted a cash cow. Executing Washington, Jefferson, and Adams creates martyrs. It creates a legend. The British were smarter than that. In this timeline, the leaders are shipped to London for a show trial that makes the O.J. Simpson case look like a parking ticket dispute. They aren't executed, they are humiliated. They are paraded through London as failed, broke tax evaders. The narrative isn't give me liberty or give me death. It becomes sorry about the property damage, Your Majesty. With the rebellion crushed, the 13 colonies are placed under martial law. The Constitution, never written. The presidency, never invented. The United States is now just British North America, the reboot. And believe it or not, for the average person, life arguably gets better immediately. Okay, let's talk about the biggest loser in this new timeline. George I Need More Real Estate, Washington. We like to think of the Founding Fathers as philosophers. But let's be real, a lot of them were essentially land speculators with massive debt. They wanted the Ohio Valley. King George said, "No, that belongs to the Native Americans." This was the proclamation of 1763, and the colonists hated it. In our actual history, as soon as the British were kicked out, Americans surged west, like Black Friday shoppers storming a Walmart, breaking treaties and taking land. But in this timeline, the British Army stays. The proclamation line becomes a hard border. The Appalachian Mountains become a wall. This means the Old Northwest, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, remains essentially an indigenous buffer state. The Iroquois Confederacy and the Shawnee aren't wiped out. They become protected protectorates of the crown, similar to how the British managed India. Without the frantic, unchecked expansion of the US government, there is no Andrew Jackson. And crucially, no Trail of Tears. But before you go thinking the British are essentially saints in red wool coats, you need to see what they're planning for the Southern economy. See, blocking westward expansion creates a pressure cooker. The Southern colonies were destroying their soil, growing tobacco and cotton. They needed fresh land to keep their Ponzi scheme of plantation agriculture going. By trapping them on the East Coast, the British aren't just protecting native land. They are slowly strangling the plantation economy. The South is now overcrowded, soil depleted, and broke. The American dream of endless land is dead on arrival. And the rich white dudes in Virginia are absolutely fuming. Here is the biggest shock to the system. The American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in our history, is canceled. Deleted, 404. Error, Gettysburg not found. Why? Because the British Empire, for all its flaws, turned against slavery way faster than the United States did. In our timeline, it took a war and 600,000 dead bodies to free the slaves in 1865. In this timeline, the British Parliament passes the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. And they don't do it with guns. They do it with cold, hard cash. Historically, when Britain banned slavery, they didn't fight the slave owners they paid them to stop. They took out a massive loan, which British citizens were paying off until 2015, by the way, and essentially bought the freedom of every enslaved person in the empire. In a British America, the Southern planters don't secede. They grumble, they whine, they write angry letters to the Times, but eventually, they take the buyout check. But wait, before you start singing God Save the King, realize that this wasn't done out of the kindness of their hearts, it was a ruthless economic pivot. The British realized that the Industrial Revolution was where the real money was. Owning people is expensive. Paying desperate factory workers pennies is cheap. By ending slavery in 1833, the American South transitions from a feudal slave society into a raw resource colony for British factories. The cotton still flows to Manchester, but the labor force is technically free, though still incredibly poor. There is no Confederacy. There is no Jefferson Davis. Just a bunch of disgruntled aristocrats drinking tea and complaining about how London has gone woke. In our timeline, 1803 was the year Thomas Jefferson pulled off the greatest Groupon deal in human history, the Louisiana Purchase. He bought the entire middle third of the continent from Napoleon for about 4 cents an acre. It was ridiculous. But in this timeline, Jefferson isn't president. He's probably running a small, failing tobacco shop in Virginia, or rotting in a London prison. So, when Napoleon needs cash to fight his wars in Europe, who does he sell to? Nobody. He can't sell it to the British, his enemy, and the colonists don't have the authority to buy it. This leaves the massive Louisiana territory in a weird limbo until the British inevitably seize it during the Napoleonic Wars. The Royal Navy rules the waves. They just sail up the Mississippi River, plant a flag in New Orleans, and say, "This is ours now. Thanks." And this matters because it completely kills the cowboy before he was even born. Without the chaotic, free-for-all expansion of the United States, the Wild West doesn't become wild. It becomes bureaucratic. The British government hated uncontrolled settlement, too hard to tax. Instead of gun-toting pioneers and lawless boomtowns like Deadwood, the expansion into the Midwest is slow, orderly, and police-patrolled. Imagine the Wild West, but instead of shootouts at high noon, everyone is filing permits for grazing rights and queuing politely at the post office. In our timeline, 1812 is when the US and Britain decided to have a rematch. The US tried to invade Canada and failed, and the British burned down the White House and succeeded. It gave us the national anthem and a lot of national pride. In this timeline, the War of 1812 is cancelled due to lack of interest. Since the 13 colonies are still British, there is no border between the US and Canada. They are just one giant, continuous dominion of the empire. This means the United States and Canada are effectively the same country. Quebec might still be grumpy about being French, but physically, North America is a unified powerhouse. Without the War of 1812, Washington, D.C. is never built up as a symbol of defiance. The White House never exists. It's probably a swamp where people dump their trash. The Capitol building? Just a sketch on a napkin that got thrown away. But while the North is enjoying peace, quiet, and unified healthcare, the British Empire is staring at the map and realizing they have a neighbor they don't like: Mexico. See, without an independent US to act as a buffer, the British Empire now shares a massive, undefined border with the Spanish Empire. And later, independent Mexico. In real history, the US stole Texas and California. In this timeline, do you really think the British, the people who colonized a quarter of the globe, are going to just let Mexico keep all that gold in California? Absolutely not. The Mexican-American War is replaced by an imperial clash of titans. In 1848, James Marshall found gold in California. In our timeline, this triggered a stampede of lunatics, dreamers, and criminals rushing west to get rich quick. It was chaos. It was freedom. It was the American dream on steroids. In this timeline, the British governor hears the word gold and immediately declares a royal mineral emergency. The British Empire doesn't do finders keepers. They do the crown owns everything under the soil. Instead of a chaotic free-for-all where a lucky idiot can become a millionaire, the California Gold Rush becomes a state-run mining operation. The Royal Navy seizes San Francisco, taking it from Mexico with polite but overwhelming force, and the whole area is locked down. You don't get individual prospectors panning in creeks. You get massive British mining companies like the East California Company, bringing in heavy machinery and underpaid laborers. It's efficient, it's safe, and it's incredibly boring. San Francisco doesn't become a wild boomtown of gambling and vice. It becomes a gray administrative center full of clerks filing tax returns on gold dust. But if you think the British taking California is weird, wait until you see what happens to the world wars without the United States involved. By seizing the gold, the British Empire becomes even richer, if that's possible. They use this wealth to fortify their grip on the Pacific. But there's a side effect. Without the Wild West to vent their aggression, and without the Civil War to learn hard lessons about modern combat, the British North American Army is soft. They are disciplined, sure, but they haven't fought a real, existential war in a century. They are complacent, and Europe is about to explode. In our timeline, World War I was a 4-year meat grinder because the sides were deadlocked. The United States sat on the sidelines until 1917, essentially waiting until everyone else was exhausted before jumping in like a WWE wrestler entering the ring in the final round. In this timeline, there is no neutrality. The moment the Archduke gets shot in Sarajevo in 1914, the entire North American continent goes to war. The British Empire can instantly call upon the manpower and industrial might of New York, Pennsylvania steel, and the vast resources of the unsevered continent. The stalemate of the trenches might still happen, but not for long. The sheer weight of British North American troops arriving in France in 1914 1917 breaks the German line. The war likely ends by 1916. The Lusitania never becomes a rallying cry because the war is already raging. The Zimmerman telegram never happens. But here is where history gets scary. A faster victory means a harsher peace. In our timeline, Woodrow Wilson pushed for the League of Nations and tried to go easy on Germany to prevent future wars. In this timeline, Wilson is just a history professor at a British university. He has no power. The British and French crush Germany completely. They dismantle the country piece by piece. There is no Treaty of Versailles. There is a total partition. This might sound good, but destroying a country creates vacuums. And vacuums are usually filled by monsters. So, with Germany carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey, the Nazi problem is solved before it even starts. Adolf Hitler remains a disgruntled painter, and the Holocaust, one of the darkest chapters in human history, is averted. You're welcome. But don't pop the champagne yet. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does geopolitics. With Germany gone, there is no buffer zone in Europe. There is nothing standing between the massive, industrial British Empire and the rising Soviet Union. In our timeline, World War II was the Allies versus the Axis. In this timeline, the 1940 sees the Great Imperial War. The British Empire, including North America, Australia, India, and half of Africa, versus Joseph Stalin. It is a clash of titans. And guess who has the advantage? The Empire. Why? Because the Manhattan Project still happens, but it happens in Toronto or London, funded by the Bank of England. The British dropped the first atomic bomb, not on Hiroshima, but perhaps on a Soviet military stronghold or a threatening fleet. The war ends. The Empire is now the undisputed, singular ruler of the globe. There is no Cold War. There is just the Empire. But before you imagine a utopian world of peace and tea, realize that a world without American rebellion is a world without American culture. You see, rebelliousness is the secret sauce of American innovation. Without the spirit of screw the rules, you don't get the cultural explosions that define the 20th century. The stability of the British Empire comes at a terrible, terrible price. Boredom. The 1950 seconds aren't filled with greasers, hot rods, and the birth of rock and roll. They are filled with polite compliance, stiff upper lips, and radio broadcasts of the Queen's speech. Let's fast forward to the modern day. You're watching this video on YouTube, a platform born from the chaotic, unregulated energy of Silicon Valley. In our British timeline, Silicon Valley is just a nice fruit orchard. Why? Because the disruptive garage startup culture is uniquely American. It requires a disregard for permits, safety, and established norms. The British Empire loves stability. In this timeline, the computer is still invented, thank you, Alan Turing, but it remains a tool for the government and military. There is no Bill Gates dropping out of Harvard. He stays in school, gets his degree, and works for the Royal Ministry of Computation. The internet still happens. Tim Berners-Lee was British, after all, but it's not the Wild West of memes, cat videos, and crypto scams. It is a polite, regulated information superhighway used strictly for education and banking. No Reddit, no Twitter, just the BBC, and maybe an online tea shop. And this brings us to the cultural wasteland. Without the US exporting its movies, you are living in a world without blockbusters. Hollywood was built by Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution and misfits running away from Edison's patent lawyers on the East Coast. In a British America, that migration never happens. There is no Star Wars. There is no Marvel. The global entertainment industry is essentially endless costume dramas about repressed emotions. You aren't watching The Avengers. You're watching Downton Abbey, season 500. So, looking back at the map of this alternate reality, we are left with a very uncomfortable question. Would the world actually be a better place if George Washington had surrendered? On one hand, the British timeline looks objectively nicer. Slavery ends 30 years earlier without a civil war. Native American nations likely survive and retain their land. The Holocaust probably doesn't happen. You have universal health care, a stable parliamentary system, and people generally follow the rules. It is a world of order, dignity, and sanity. But on the other hand, it is a world without spark. The United States is an experiment in chaos, greed, and impossible ambition. By rejecting the safety of the empire, Americans forced themselves to innovate just to survive. We did the hard things, not because they were smart, but because we wanted to prove we could. And that is the ultimate trade-off. The British Empire offers you safety, the American Revolution offers you greatness. In the British timeline, humans probably never walk on the moon. Why? Because the moon race was a flexing contest between the US and the Soviets. The British Empire doesn't need to flex. They already own the Earth. They would look at the price tag of the Apollo program, sip their tea, and say, that seems rather excessive, doesn't it? So, do you want to live in a safe, quiet, polite world where nothing bad ever happens? Or do you want to live in the timeline that gave us jazz, the internet, national parks, and the freedom to be absolutely insane? The revolution didn't just create a country, it created a mindset. And for better or worse, that mindset built the modern world. History is messy, freedom is dangerous. But hey, at least we don't have to pay a license fee to own a TV.